Welcome. I'm Jim Tolles. I'm glad I get to join all of you today, talk about the bliss of being nobody. It's kind of a funny topic because it's a space that's always with us. So, how do we really talk about it? What is it really? And so, we'll get to explore this space, and as always, before we get started, I like to encourage everybody to take a few deep breaths. Give yourselves a chance to slow down, to be here now, to check in with your body. How we feel in this body has a huge impact on how we think, what we can even learn and hear. So give yourselves those moments to breathe and to relax inwards and just start to pay attention to yourself. For anyone who's new to me, who's stumbled across this live streaming, my name is Jim Tolles. I'm a spiritual teacher and I blog regularly at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. And I have live streams about every 2 weeks. And I always start off these talks by encouraging people to come into their breathing, to breathe and relax, because the more relaxed you are, the more open you are, and the easier it is to know when something I say resonates. I'd like to remind everybody that resonance comes from within you. It's not something someone does to you, it's just a response inside when something feels true. If you're open to that truth, then it tends to feel good. If you're not open to that truth, then it tends to bring up an issue that's kind of restricting you and blocking you from hearing something that's true. So if somebody can also type into the chat pod on the right hand side to let me know you can hear me, that would be great. In general, I usually free flow for about 30-40 minutes. And then I start taking questions, and you can type in your questions in the chat pod. You just have to be logged in to YouTube to be able to post questions. Generally speaking, I encourage people to limit any cross chatter, kind of talking between you, because I don't want to miss any questions people may have for me. Thanks for letting me know, Carson. I appreciate it. So continue to take a few deep breaths, and your minds maybe still be busy, emotions may be coming. But see if you can just move your attention to the space that notices these thoughts. Some of you, I'm sure, have done this, and others have not. But it's just an important thing to start to realize that you are not your thoughts, that you can move your attention to where you are noticing them. So just draw your attention there. You may notice that your mind doesn't really want to settle. It wants to jump back into a thought no sooner than you've moved out of that thought. But the minute you notice you've gotten involved again, you've already come back out. So just practice that for a few moments. For people who are just joining, I'm teaching people the very simple technique of witnessing thoughts and emotions and sensations. It's really the same. We often start with witnessing our thoughts, but you can witness your breath. You can witness your body. You can witness different emotions. So if you're just starting to join, take a few deep breaths and start to watch. Watch all these thoughts running around. Watch how they try and draw you into their stories, into the ideas of the past or the future, things you want or things you don't want. And just see if you can start to watch it. And there's nothing more to do with this. We don't want this to be complicated. The ego likes things to be complicated at times. to know that it's difficult and then it can succeed at it, and all the different ways people's egos can be with something. And there's all different levels of inner interaction going on, but you can watch it. Right? And so you just start to create this interesting space between the ego self you think you are and that deeper space of presence. And this deeper space of presence that I'm pointing you towards is the space of nobody. And I really just want people to kind of practice with this a little bit, because talking about this space gets silly because it's just this isness, right? This space of being, presence. Sometimes I'll call it love. And I don't want you to think that we're sitting here having a conceptual argument or conversation about this type of stuff, because that's silly. And that happens too much in a lot of spiritual communities. One of my students, I loved how she described this space as anticlimactic. Like, it's not a feeling. It's not a new set of ideas. It's not an experience. It's the canvas that holds all paints, all colors. Right? It's the sky that holds all types of weather. So just keep drawing your attention back. I know it's so easy, like when I start talking, like there's a party who wants to immediately start getting involved in agreeing or disagreeing or being confused or being blank towards whatever I'm saying. Right? We're used to projecting our attention out, so it's very different to start to turn that and focus it in. Sometimes we'll call the space of nobody silence. Right? We're not talking about human silence. There's all sorts of noises that continue on, including what's going on in our heads. So before I really get going, talking too much, please feel free to put a comment, if you understand it. If you don't understand it, that's okay too. And I can direct you a little bit more towards this space that's just watching. It's just watching your experience in your human body. It's watching emotions come up. Sometimes we'll say the space feels really peaceful, but really the human peacefulness is a secondary quality. It comes as the body kind of relaxes, because this is a very open and clear space that allows you to be as you are. We tend to relax when we finally allow ourselves to be as we are. And we tend to feel a lot of loving kindness. And I'm going to make a distinction today between love. When I talk about pure love is just this space where everything is allowed. There's no judgment on anything. Everything is embraced. But as we go into that space of pure love, a sense of human loving kindness tends to arise. A space of clarity tends to arise because we're no longer caught up in the clouds. Our thoughts are kind of like clouds, and that makes things hazy and indistinct, difficult to discern what's going on. So please let me know if this is making sense or if it's not. We use the breath to relax into the body because it helps us start to notice the clouds, that all the things we've been caught up in. We actually don't have to be physically relaxed to be in this space. Right? And that's actually really helpful for us later on, because when we get agitated or irritated by different things that come up throughout life, we can return to this space of the witness and we start to watch that agitation. We can watch a lot of difficult feelings and experiences arise, things that we don't like. And so it's important to once again understand that this is not a human experience, that anything you experience that may be pleasurable right now and enjoyable is a secondary thing. It comes after. Thanks for letting me know, Susan. And one of those things that does tend to come up is the sense of bliss more in the human experience. That we just feel really, really good when we allow ourselves to just be and to drop into the space of presence. And in the space of presence, we are a nobody, right? We're not a somebody. A somebody is a set of beliefs and ideas that you have to live out. It's our own little actor-actress games that we play with ourselves. We put on this role, we put on the costume, and we pretend we're Jim or Carson or Susan or Dale or Mike or all these different names, right? And we go around and we try to act out this little fantasy that we have in our head. And sometimes life plays along and it's nice to us, and sometimes life isn't nice to us, which a lot of times has nothing to do with the role we're playing, but we often think that it does. So just dropping this personality, this ego sense, is a powerful, powerful thing to start to see what's going on in life, how much influence we actually have in it, and how little influence we have in it. And so the space of being a nobody is actually a very clear space. It doesn't presume things. It just looks at them. Once again, I said, as we come out of being a somebody, depending on how we orient towards that, because initially it's very scary for people. We feel like we're losing something. People say that, they think they're going to lose their mind or are losing their mind, right? And that just shows the attachment to certain ways of thinking. Being in the space of nobody really is like a clear sky, that it just sees what's in front of you. It doesn't get less able to discern. It actually gets more able to discern that these thoughts about who we are and how life should go and all these other things that come in that big, crazy, unconscious ego package get in the way of seeing what's going on. They're what confuse us. And that becomes very frustrating. And so when somebody is often upset enough with being their somebody, their ego self, they get to that point of really letting go. And when they really let go into that space of nobodiness, a lot of good feelings can come up if they really were sick of themselves. And it can feel very blissful. And sometimes if it's a strong enough letting go, it's more than just kind of a touching into reality. It's more than just maybe a spiritual opening. It becomes that spiritual awakening that moves and grows. And as I said, once again, this is about orientation, because if somebody is still kind of holding on and they don't want to let go and they drop into this space, it's not necessarily a blissful experience that arises. And once again, the bliss isn't arising. It's an experience that comes out of our orientation towards the truth of ourselves. The more we are in acceptance of the space of nobody, a certain level of bliss just kind of becomes quieter and quieter, right? A lot of the things that we look for are actually agitated states. Bliss, ecstasy, the loving kindness, romance, right? Those are very agitated states. They're not at rest. So they're going to come and go. So it is important to not hold on to that. And if we want to talk about like true bliss, like true love, that's just simply that space of pure acceptance. So it's not an emotional state. It's not an experiential state, which I think is an important thing to just continue to emphasize, because it can be a real confusion for people when they think they're supposed to be feeling a certain way, or they want to feel a certain way. And then they get caught up in seeking that and going for it and looking for more spiritual tools and more different ways to try and make yourself feel good. But that's just no different than any other kind of addiction, is it? And these types of addictions simply show us signs that there are core issues that we have not dealt with yet. Because when we really are at rest in the space of being nobody, we don't need anything. We don't need our experience to change from whatever it is. And so it can be a very simple practice to just have like a weekend of silence, where you don't do anything other than just sit, have some food, do very, very minimal things, maybe a walk, maybe some light yoga stretching or something like that. And just start to watch what happens to the ego self when you put it into that sort of human silence. No media, no phone. Because oftentimes that's when our issues start to really reveal themselves. We start to get really uncomfortable with being with ourselves. moving towards the space of nobody is not a lot of fun for a lot of people, as I said, because of orientation that we think. And as we get clear about how we actually are feeling, we start to find a lot of issues are being revealed. So once again, this space is just clarity. It's just openness. It's presence. It just sees what is. So if there's old pain in your heart still there, then there's old pain in your heart still there. And we start to realize that so much of what we do in life is kind of a masking. It's a masking of our issues, or it's an acting out of different issues. So even as you're sitting here, I encourage you to come back to that space of nobodiness that I was talking about earlier, of just witnessing thoughts, because it's so easy, once again, to project forward, to get caught up in these different words I'm using. And as I've kind of earlier said, it's kind of a silly discussion to even be having, to be talking about the space that always is within us. And it's like, even as I use words like nobody, nobody is not that space. It's just a word, right? It's just a way for me to point you towards something that's already within you. Susan's asking if this is self-surrender, and I think that's a good way to point towards it too. It's surrendering towards all our kind of hidden actions and decisions and things that are going on inside us all the time that actually require a lot of energy. We're just so used to putting energy into somebodyness that we don't realize we do it. This is why I'm often using my metaphor of the clenched fist. Like, if we've been clenching our fists for our whole lives, the concept of letting go, right, and allowing our fists to relax, to go from this to an open space, seems crazy. It seems difficult. We've got just so much unconscious energy just keeps going to that hand to make it stay tight, to keep it together. Being an ego is very similar in that regard. That we have to keep remembering who we are and what we like and what we do and how we do it and who we interact with and what we like in regards to physical stuff, to heart stuff, to mind stuff, and what we don't like in all those things, and what we think is safe and what we don't think is safe. And it's a really, really long list, but we're just so good at it, we don't even realize we do it. And so when we come towards this reversal of focus away from the self, the human experience, the emotional experience, the thinking experience, to this other part that requires no energy, it can be really confusing for a time. And then because we're still operating from the unconscious ego for the most part, right, we're thinking in those terms. Right, it's a horrible thing. It's the jailer, who's telling you about freedom. And when the jailer's always lived in the jail, he or she will tell you that freedom's terrible. You won't know what to do with it. It's just all this stuff outside. You don't want that. You don't want to be in that. Right? It depends on the person. Some people, their jailers are slightly different. They want to go towards something, but they still are attached to the jail. It's like, well, how will I know where the walls are? What I can and can't do? I mean, there's an immense freedom being nobody, because nobody can be anybody. In a different way, it's kind of like being an ice sculpture and melting back to water. And once you're back to water, you can actually reform into any ice sculpture, anybody, any somebody. So you can become a leader, right? And then you can melt away if that no longer feels true to you. And then you can become a follower, right? And it's just so flexible. The space of being somebody has tons of rules, and that's just the role you have to act out. And even when we think we give ourselves a lot of freedom, we really don't. It's not that hard to find our walls, to find, how far we're willing to go, and then suddenly the unconscious ego reveals itself again and says, no, that's too far. Can't go past this. This is the wall. It's right here. So you can be on this side of the wall, but you can't be on that side of the wall. A lot of it definitely takes us into continued work towards our fundamental issues. And as some of you know, I've been kind of emphasizing those as kind of the foundation behind any core issue. And the fundamental issues aren't anything new. It's the drive to procreate, it's the fear of death, and an aversion to pain, which is closely linked to fear of death, of course, because if we're in pain, that could mean we could be in threat of dying. But also at times, sometimes pain is worse, and it leads people towards suicide, which I do not advocate. But it's just kind of an example to understand that sometimes we're more scared of pain and continued pain of some kind, that death doesn't look so bad. And those are really the three fundamental drivers that drive most decisions. It's why a lot of fear tactics in marketing and politics and all that stuff can work on people, is because they're still going on in the background. But when we step back, and we step back to the space of nobody, we're even stepping behind those, that we can start to watch those mechanisms work inside when that fear comes up that we're going to be hurt in some way, or that drive, that lusty drive towards having a sexual partner, right? And the sex drive has nothing to do with like whether we intellectually want to have children or any of that. It has everything to do with like what the mechanism in the instinctual body is. So we got a lot of leftover stuff in the human body that needs retraining and help, but we're not going to really get there through trying to be a somebody, through like trying to think it away or something like that. By stepping out of our own story, we start to see these things happen. And the simplest way to start to retrain the body, in my experience, really is through breathing and relaxation. Because most of those fundamental drivers actually are agitated states themselves. They're going to drive you to get away from something that may be painful or may be threatening. And they may drive you towards people that you think, you want to have sexual relationships with. Right? So those are agitated states. Those are not at rest. And in those ways, they don't really allow you to choose your actions. You're not really rationally thinking. We like to think we are, and we create elaborate egos to justify all kinds of things. Even like having tons of money, right? There's a lot of fear of death and fear of like being in some kind of pain that drives people to keep gathering more and more, because there's a need to kind of feel safe, right? If you have enough stuff, you'll feel safe. It's a real problem for a lot of people, and it causes greater social problems because of economic inequalities. It ends up meaning some people have too much and others don't have enough. And that's not healthy for our community. So stepping back to just witness all the stuff that goes on inside you is stepping outside of all of that. It's giving you perspective. And it's kind of a funny thing that we step back and we kind of create this illusion of duality when we're stepping into a space of oneness within ourselves. But it's been my experience that it's kind of like that duality that you're looking at just starts to implode, starts to break down because your energy is out of it. It doesn't do it immediately. We've been spending a lot of time as human beings trying to build all this stuff up, right? It doesn't explode overnight, but that's also not to say that it couldn't. So I don't want to put any hard rules around this. We're such an amazing beings. And when we step into the space of being nobody, of the space of presence within ourselves, we can let that amazingness start to show itself, to start to move us rather than trying to control things, or even being out of control. To me is a kind of control of another somebody, right? It's another set of choices around like what somebody will or won't do. So it's kind of a strange way to be controlling your experience by being out of control. But there's a reality to that, if this is an issue for you, that I encourage you to look towards to understand better. Because when some people are out of control, it allows them to control others to do things for them, right? Because they look like they can't handle it. It's really messed up, but these are the things that the ego self does. And as all of this stuff starts breaking down, bliss and loving kindness start to kind of show up a little bit more. But maybe not so loudly as they might first do with like your first spiritual opening you've ever had, or a spiritual awakening in the beginning. Right? It can be kind of more of a subtle hum of a happy human body that's just kind of going on and just moving and no longer being restricted or having cortisol dumped in its bloodstream because you're always scared by something, right? There's a lot of things around the space of nobody and the peacefulness that arises that really are understated, that just aren't going to scream out at you. In the same way that the ground supports us, that we walk on it and it grows food for us and does all kinds of things, and we desperately need the ground, but we don't even realize it's there. It's just there. Just like this space that I'm pointing towards. At which point the somebody inside, that ego self runs in and says, well, this is boring, or I don't like this, or how am I going to survive? Like, it always likes to make some ridiculous thing like that. Like, how am I going to survive? And it's like, well, if you're seeing from a clear space inside, it's not that hard to decide what to do to take care of yourself. Right? The landscape in front of you is wide open. You can see all sorts of different ways to go. Then you'll have another ego self that runs in and says, but I don't know how to choose. Right? Because if you don't have reference points, if you don't have a system to evaluate things in front of you, then the ego self just feels overwhelmed. And this, of course, is another layer. You're going to go through different subtle layers of ego selves because of how many layers we use or we built up over time. So that actually draws you more towards the intuitive nature within us, this arising that just kind of moves and kind of knows when it's time. And it's a very different way to experience life. To just move when something arises inside you. First, are you saying you can't hear me, or that you can? Because it came through as can. So from Carson, it says, in the last year or so, I've had a distinct feeling of my spirit and my body are distinctly separate. I don't know if that is healthy for everyone, but it's really helped. Well, I think this is kind of what I'm pointing towards, Carson, is the space of presence within inside us. We can also call it our spirit. But as we step into that, as this other parts of us kind of start to dissolve and break down, there is kind of a feeling of deepening of union. Now, ultimately, we're always united with spirit, with consciousness. We're never separate. That's the truth of oneness. But for some reason, we seem to need to create a sense of separation kind of within ourselves to start to be able to look at the ego stuff we've identified with the body we've identified with. And that's a big deal. Like, it's difficult to get people to unidentify with their bodies. And that's where kind of, I would say, advanced work is. The more we can be at peace with our body being however it is, whether it's sick or it's healthy, whether it's hurt or whether it's whole, right? That's a powerful thing. And the more you can be at peace with your body in that way, right, you're actually dealing with the fundamental issue of, whether you're going to live or die. And we all know we're going to die, but we're not usually at peace with it. It's kind of like in our last moments of life, we might actually be at peace with the whole concept of dying. So if we can, in a different sense, die before we die, in a sense of dying to being attached to our body. If this is a phrase that's been used before, that's very, very powerful. And I think a lot of that starts with that stepping back. To just watch this thing move and understand that this is a temporary thing. It's just a car you're driving in. And you won't drive in it forever. So once again, I encourage you to take a few minutes to once again move to that space of witnessing inside. Just experience it. Whenever I bring my attention there, I find it to be very expansive. And it just doesn't feel like it ends. And I really want to keep encouraging you towards that, even as you're listening to me. Right? There's a deeper energy that connects and talks. You don't have to actually think that hard about anything that I'm saying right now. But this deeper space within that watches, it will help you to break down all the ego stuff that's still there, and it helps you to flow even more deeply. I mean, wherever you are in your spiritual path, this is with you. And it's the most important connection you can make, because it's also not even just making a connection, it's a realization that it's there. And in realizing that, you don't have to be the somebody you think you have to be. We spend a lot of energy trying to be these somebodies, as I said. And it takes no energy to be nobody. And then look at all the objections that still come up. Look at how quickly you jump into an idea as soon as a new one comes along. The space allows us to think and feel. It's not going to cut you off from that. It actually opens up your scope of feeling and thinking. So it's very much a place that will naturally broaden the space out of your life to see more clearly. But when you get caught up in the nobody or the somebodyness, right, that's a very narrow place. Once again, there's now a ton of rules about who you can be, how you can act. Farishta says, I look forward to the day of being nobody again. But you already are. That's the point. It's just, where is your focus? And can you be in the space of nobody and allow pain to come? Because that's a big problem for people. Once again, one of our fundamentals is an aversion towards pain. And we think that if we're feeling something painful, that something is wrong. And that's not necessarily the case. It's just a human experience that's arising. And a lot of the ways that we drop into deeper space of nobody is going through the pain of the ego and letting that go. If we don't go through the pain of the ego, then it tends to stay intact. And we tend to keep working through, working from that understanding of life. So this, once again, nobodiness is not an experience. It's the space that makes room for all experiences. And the reason I call this the bliss of being nobody is because often as we stop trying to be a somebody, believing the story or fighting what's coming up and whatever our process is, then that bliss starts to kind of radiate out, but it'll come and go and we don't hold on to it. And as I also said, the truer bliss is that simply being. And nothing is required of you. But this is not a stupid place, and I say this in so many places, that this just makes it easier to interact with life and to take conscious action. And this is what's badly needed in this world, is people who can let go of themselves to see what may actually need to be done in life. And there are some things that will need to be done to get food or take care of our families. It doesn't inhibit us from that. It doesn't make us kind of groggy and lost. That's usually what people think of when they think of bliss. They think of this kind of high, expansive state where they're just kind of, floating around. They're completely ungrounded, and it's a passing experience. It's going to come and it's going to go. And thankfully it does, because you don't really interact particularly well from that space. The space of nobody gives you flexibility to move through experiences, to move to different emotional states and move out of them. You don't resist painful emotions. You allow the good ones to come and to go. Same with the body. You're better able to see what thoughts are useful in your head and others that you just need to stop thinking. And that's an important retraining neurologically for our brains, to let go of unhealthy ways of thinking that are self-defeating or mean towards others, mean towards ourselves, or whatever it may be. It just becomes so clear. And then you simply have to take the actions that arise. It becomes natural to see certain things. And then you say, okay, this is what's next in my path. And for people who've had egos that want to control things, that'll frustrate them. They'll say, but that's not what I want, or I want it, right? It exposes the next thing. It's well, are you going to go further on your path by trusting this arising, trusting this intuitive guidance that's coming out of you when you rest in the space of openness? Or are you going to go back to the old behaviors? If you go back to the old behaviors, that's what you reinforce, and you maintain this inner friction. And it's really just your own friction with yourself. It's kind of like trying to row upstream. Right? The stream, as you're starting to really acknowledge and be open and clear, right? You're letting go. When you let go, the stream just starts to push you down, right? You start to see what's going on in the river. But when we're still caught up in being somebody, we're paddling in circles, or we're paddling upstream, or we're taking ourselves onto rocks, or beaching ourselves. We really make life difficult. There are legitimate human difficulties in life. Earthquakes, hurricanes. Those are legitimate difficulties. We're not making those up. Those are just part of life. But we're not really able to engage with them particularly well when we're still trying to be a somebody and trying to control everything. It's much easier to deal with everything when we move into the space of being a nobody, the space of presence. And then we can see what needs to be done in any situation. So once again, I encourage you, Take a few deep breaths. Draw your attention back to witnessing your thoughts. And then any questions that people have, I'm happy to answer here. Hi, Farishta. The most stressful pattern I have is I'm not supposed to be here where I am. It's the most debilitating. Well, even that's just a thought. You don't have to believe it. And that's just a big thing that we have to understand. It's like when these thoughts come, we don't have to believe them. We're used to believing our thoughts. We assume that like whatever's running around in our heads is something that we should trust, and that's not always the case. And coming to the space of nobody isn't a space of distrust. It's just perspective. It's just, okay, here's this thought. Now you can make a choice. Do you want to believe that you're not where you're supposed to be? I mean, that in and of itself is a really problematic idea, right? Because wherever we are, it's where we are. So the only sane thing to do is to accept where we are. And whatever things we can do in that situation or what we can do, and to let ourselves be at peace with that reality. Farisha says, yes, it's hard to see that sometime when you get caught up, but yes, it's just another thought that's harder to see through. It's harder to see through because you have more commitment to it. And so that's other areas, where I encourage you can journal about it to kind of find out, what are the other attachments that are going on, and what are they illuminating, what other core issues are being revealed in that moment. And so once again, stepping on the space of nobody allows you to more perspective, to see like, what are the unconscious choices that are going on right now? Because generally speaking, when we have food and shelter, right, when we're warm, we have water and fresh air, we're okay. A lot of the rest of the stuff are emotional choices that we make, and we don't realize we make them. Thanks for your comments, Farishta. From Susan, accepting the thoughts, then letting them go. Yeah, that's basically, part of stepping out, but also accepting emotions, right? And accepting body sensations. So that's how we go deeper, Susan. We start to accept all of this and really understand we have no control over a lot of it. But, it starts by just that continued stepping back to just kind of see these things and see how things are working inside you, right? So that the stepping back into watching really leads towards much more informed self-inquiry versus sometimes we get into a self-improvement pattern where we're beating ourselves up. We're like, okay, so this feels bad, so how do I get rid of it, right? And so that's like taking your left hand and your right hand and then punching each other for a while. I mean, that's just kind of insane. And at certain times, I think, earlier on the path when you're dealing with things that are clearly hurting you, like addiction, right? Something like that. Yeah, that can actually be useful to say like, no, this isn't right for me. And it may still be coming from an ego sense, but, it helps you kind of work through things. But the further you go on the spiritual path, the more we start to let go of those judgments about what's right or wrong, to just kind of see what's happening. And the more you step back, a lot of times these things do start to fall apart on their own. And so that's a lot of times you'll hear spiritual teachers say, just keep silent, right? Just keep coming back to the present moment, because so many of these things, you're not under any particular threat or stress to do anything. So don't do anything. Just let them burn and just sit in that burning of your own awareness. Freeze just said, also another pattern is I try to get through my mind using my mind, right? And this is what I'm saying, when we step back to watch, we're actually stepping out of the mind in a certain way. So thanks. From Carson, for the longest time, I thought I was transgender, but when I became more spiritually aware, I realized that I am neither male or female. I don't really identify with either gender. Is this odd? No. You don't need to. I mean, I always say, accept whatever is. And so whatever sexual organs you have and were given in this life, that's what is. But you don't need to take on a gender identity, right? That's just another ego layer. And you can step into the space of nobody, and if you feel like being gendered man today, you can do that. And if tomorrow you feel like being gendered female, then it's such a flexible place. It's a non-issue. From the spiritual sense, how you want to present yourself, you just start to learn how to present yourself more from a place of joy. So anything related to, what ego way you want to present yourself, I'm not going to particularly find an issue with it, I just encourage you to step out of all of it so that you have the flexibility to choose. And typically when we do that, Carson, we tend to choose to be more kind. But that just seems to happen, right? That's why, I'm talking about bliss. It's kind of like a byproduct. Like loving kindness is kind of a byproduct. When we allow ourselves to just be, we tend to be kinder to everyone, including ourselves. When we are rejecting ourselves, and that's a lot of what being a somebody, being an ego, it does, is it rejects a lot of ourselves and says we can be this, but we can't be that. That's kind of a self-immolation, a kind of self-violence, when we don't allow ourselves the full freedom to be as we are. And that tends to make people angry and upset and depressed. And it makes some people lash out, and some people lash out at themselves, and it drives addiction, right? So there's a huge, huge issue with trying to be the ego self like this, the way we do it. It's making people very miserable. So stepping into this space of oneness, of nobodiness, is a step into a huge level of freedom. And in that space of freedom, we tend to feel a lot better. You're welcome, Susan and Carson. A question from Will. Hey, Jim, the career path and choosing the right career during awakening is where my ego really has hold of me. Totally draining. Yeah, it is draining. But, once again, this is kind of that whole space of stepping back and letting the river draw you. To see what starts to arise when you allow. And then you have to trust that, right? Each time we grab for the paddle too soon, when there's no need to paddle, we start to spin ourselves in circles or head back upstream. And that can be really frustrating, because then you're kind of yo-yoing, right? You'll kind of take a few steps towards wherever the river is pulling you, then you paddle back upstream again, right? And so that's exhausting. And then you kind of let go again, sort of. And then, so it's kind of that yo-yo effect. And that's where you'll often hear other spiritual teachers saying, you have to let go all the way. You have to go all the way, right? You can't barter with the ego self. You're going to have to trust things that are rising inside you, and trust your own ability to be clear about the things that you care about, and how to guide them and grow them, and how to get support when you need it. Some egos can obviously try and do too much on their own and think that it's all on them, but we are really insignificant on this planet. I mean, collectively we can do a lot together, both good and bad, but even then, in this great big universe, we are small. And I feel like the ego always expands itself, thinks it's bigger than it actually is. And so that's why it's also interesting, challenge, or feels challenging to the ego selves we cling to. When we go to the space of nobody, which isn't a thing, which acknowledges that we are kind of nothing. And yet there's a funny reality to that space where there's this incredible freedom and expansiveness, an opening of our powers, our gifts, and our love, and all that stuff, when we no longer are caring about how big or strong or loving or whatever we think we should be. Once we stop caring, like, everything starts to open up in a whole different way, whole deeper way. Will says, that's me with the paddle and yo-yoing. You're not alone. I've definitely done my fair share of yo-yoing. You're welcome. Thanks for everybody's questions and comments so far. What else do people want to talk about? And the more you practice with it, you can talk from that space of nobodiness. It's like I'm doing it right now. It's just you don't think about what you're saying. It just starts to arise. So it's a different feeling. And I've been doing it long enough that I'm very, very comfortable with it. And I don't try to fight the words that come out. But the words are still secondary. It's still kind of the sense of arising from a deeper part, right? That truthful space of presence. And I know that I'm still exploring different levels of where I allow myself to go, and, hidden walls and unconscious decisions. And as you continue in that sort of self-inquiry, you kind of dissolve more of these things away, and you flow more freely, more openly. Sometimes I'll have a student say, it's just so simple, isn't it? And the answer is yes, it is. We make being a person extraordinarily, excruciatingly difficult. Being free is a powerful, powerful thing because a lot of life can't control you anymore. And there's a lot of control going on. This isn't about fighting systems and things like that, but just understand that a lot of how we interact with other people is often through control. We're trying to control them to get something because of our own insecurities and our own stories and how we want people to interplay with our stories. And they're doing the same to us. Right? So we can go back to the example of somebody who's out of control. Right? And they're trying to control other people to make decisions for them or to help them or save them or fix them. Right? So that's still a kind of control. Well, Carson, it's not an achievement. So this is once again, while I want to emphasize that this space of nobody's already here. It's not an achievement. If we're talking about letting go of, being a somebody, that's the opposite of achieving. See, achieving has the connotation of we're doing something to get somewhere. But like my closed fist example, you're not achieving an open hand. You're just no longer trying and striving to keep the fist closed, right? Once again, all your energy has been taught to keep trying to be a person, to think in a certain way and act in a certain way. And you're just so used to it that it doesn't seem like it's difficult, but it actually is. That's why one of the experiences people often have as they move through their spiritual work is deepening and relaxation. It's just, right? And why is that? It's because they stop putting so much energy into this latest issue they let go of. But when we step into the space of nobodiness, we've already stepped out of all of our issues. Right? That's that space of awakenedness, of enlightenment. We can use so many different words for that space of presence, and that you already can touch right now. Now, a lot of what people do think about achieving is sustaining a certain level of human relaxation. But that, I think, is what a lot of people mean when they're talking about enlightenment. So that's a completely different thing. But it's driven better when we can allow ourselves to just move to the space of witnessing, because we're more clear about what we're still getting caught up in, what we're still believing in. And we can start to make more conscious choices to just let it go and to draw attention back to witnessing. Because most things don't need us to do that much. And over time, I believe there are definitely physiological changes in the brain and our body chemistry and all that sort of stuff, so that we tend to stay more in human relaxation. But even then, it's just kind of changing where our sine curve is. So if our sine curve is like this, right, we're going up because we're excited or scared, and then we come back down to rest, right? We kind of move like this, but we run along a baseline. So as we relax and we let go of trying to be somebody, I feel like we move the baseline further down, right? And then the swells of the sine curve are a little bit lower, right? We don't get as high, we don't get as low. So that's that kind of achievement thing that I think a lot of people confuse enlightenment with. And it's important to understand that difference. Because the space of being in nobody requires no effort at all. It's already here. I will. I mistake the pain of going through the ego as me just getting it all wrong and making myself feel worse. Like I'm getting the whole awakening wrong. How do we know if we were on the right path? Well, you can hear there's a trap in that very question, right? Because there's a right, wrong, that's an ego thing. So just starting by stepping out and looking at that judgment, and that there's just so much judgment in that question to kind of look at it. I was like, all right, so this ego self is still trying to attain something. It still wants to get something. So what is it trying to get? If we don't take that next step back, this is where a lot of people do get kind of trapped or end up on a spiritual plateau or stuck, right? Because they're trying to play this game by the old rules. Once again, this is the jailer in the jail cell telling you about freedom, and he's never been outside to know what freedom is. So this is a common question, and there's nothing wrong with having it, but it's just another encouragement that I'd like to make to come back to your breathing, relax and step back and just kind of watch the question now. Watch the pain, watch the question, watch all the ways the ego is trying to keep you involved and is trying to resolve this thing. And as I also said earlier, like one of our fundamental issues is we have an aversion to pain. It's just kind of the part of our instinctual makeup. And we have to rewrite that. And that's kind of a big thing as the spiritual path progresses for most of us, is that we're rewriting this deep fundamental thing that says, I don't want to feel pain. Instead, we're saying pain is part of human existence. I have to be at peace with that too. So the more you can be at peace with that pain, the more things start to resolve themselves. Let me know if that's helpful, Will. And Carson says, I used to have to label everything in my life. I am this or that, but I never do that anymore. That's good. There's some categorizations that can be useful from time to time about what's going on in life, but we don't need to hold on to them. It's like words and ideas should be helping us. That's a big thing to emphasize. It's like if they're not helping us, if they're trapping us, or if they're limiting our ability to interact with a situation, we should be mindful of that. Say like, what am I limiting? What am I cutting out? Why am I cutting it out? What am I trying to achieve? Because kind of as I just mentioned in the last question, there's a lot of hidden motives that we have to kind of flush out and look at. It's like, well, what does this question get me? What does this label get me? And what am I trying to do? A lot of times we're trying to make ourselves feel better mentally by saying we're better than someone, or other people, they'll go the other way. They'll make themselves feel bad because there's deeper hidden pain inside of them that they're trying to work out, but they don't realize they're trying to work it out. So they just keep saying, oh, I'm a bad, terrible person or something like that, which is echoing some other pain, usually from childhood. So if we start to label it in that regard, to start to say, oh, this is a childhood pain, right, that's coming up, rather than labeling more externally on the world, then that kind of changes and shifts some things around in our orientation, and that can be kind of helpful to start to see things in that light. One of my students was mentioning, like, he was starting to kind of label different types of thoughts in his head, right? But that as a means of stepping out of them, to kind of look at them and to see that they're not him. They're just certain types of thoughts that just kind of keep going round and round, and they try to like put on different clothes, different forms, but they're really the same thought. Will says, very helpful. I tend to feel more vulnerable and question when processing fear and ego is aggravated. That's because we all kind of shrink down to our smallest level of thinking in those moments, right? That's when we're in that contracted state. And that's precisely when we need to come back to our practice. Is why I talk about practicing when things are easy, meditating and journaling, because then it's more readily in our thought process to even do it. When we shrink down to that old contracted part of us that's just thinking in the old terms, and everything kind of becomes impossible and small and that sort of stuff. So that's when we really need to be working at our practice. So we say more quickly, oh, I'm going to come and I'm going to breathe and I'm going to look at this awfulness. And you feel awful for a while because we're used to energizing it. And then eventually it breaks down. From Farisha, I feel like I'm between two worlds, the old egoic one that I don't believe in, but the mind programs are still trying to load and run in the world of truth. Yeah, and that's why we have to really be dedicated in this sort of step back to being nobody. Step back and watch, step back and watch, step back and watch. You get sucked in, you step back and watch. And that's sort of an important, once again, it's kind of a physiological retraining, right, for the brain, because our brain is built to operate a certain way. We've been training it for years to think in certain regards. So that's just kind of the simplest thing. And, I still think the simplicity of it's important to appreciate, that it really is simple. You just keep stepping back. Breathe and relax, step back. The breathe and relax is a appreciation that our body tends to tense up when we start thinking and getting upset. And so we're unlearning that part of the body through the breath. Thanks to everyone's questions and comments. And if somebody hasn't had a chance to ask or say something, feel free to. And no need to be shy. And for anyone who's new to me, if you feel like donating for this talk, you're more than welcome to. It's for free, but my work is run by donations. You can go to spiritualawakeningprocess.com, and there's a PayPal donation button on the right-hand side. You don't have to feel obligated to, But if you feel moved to, your support is appreciated. And once again, I just encourage you, come back to witnessing your thoughts as we're sitting here. You step back and you watch, what's the mind doing now? What's it got it caught up in? What's going on in the heart and the body? And Susan says, breathe, relax, step back. Just wrote that down. Thank you. You're welcome. Yeah, once again, it's very simple. And isn't that great? Like, it would stink if this was like astrophysics. Like, I wouldn't be able to get it. We'd all be sitting there, we'd look at the complex equation on the board, if being nobody and being at peace was difficult, and we'd all just throw up our hands. But it's not difficult. It has nothing to do with any sort of intellectual intelligence. And as some of you know, intellectual intelligence can become a burden at times. It can get in the way of just allowing yourself to be, because the intellectual intelligence tends to have like a ton more rules about who you are and how you're supposed to be, and yada, yada, yada. And so that's why I often say, just be nobody. When all those rules about how you're supposed to act and who you're supposed to interact with and what you're supposed to have in your life, when they start to really weigh you down, just step back, breathe, relax, step back, be nobody. I mean, you already are. And that really does lead towards that next part where we start to see how this inner flow is moving us. Start to see how life is flowing around us. So the space of oneness within us, just as I said, brings greater clarity on duality. Non-duality brings clarity on duality. You start to see, wow, look at all this stuff and how it's moving. And it just seems kind of natural at some point. Something kind of calls to us to flow in a certain way, but we stay present with it. We just stay in that space of oneness within ourselves and flow in our human self. And it's this interesting paradox of oneness and duality that we live in. And it can make life an exploration. It can make it a joy. It can make it blissful. Because you're no longer beating yourself up to try and be something. You're just you. This body, this mind, all of this stuff's going to go away anyway. You don't get to keep it. If any of us manages to make it to 90 years old, that's quite a long run for a human being. We're pretty lucky, but it's still really short. We'll just melt back into the greater consciousness of life at the end of it. So this is why, many people come to the next natural conclusion is do what you love. Tommy Ford says, thanks. You're welcome. Yeah, just do what you love. When you come back to that space of clarity and you start to flow, what you love becomes more and more obvious. And sometimes it's not what the ego thought, and sometimes it is. So we go within before going out, right? So we go inside to the space of oneness, and then it's easier to step back out into life and to understand how you want to interact with it, where you want to go with it, and what matters to you. So I think we have time for one last question. Thanks to everybody who's joined me today. If you're new to me, my name is Jim Tolles. I'm a spiritual teacher. I blog regularly at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. I also have an ebook called Everyday Spirituality, Cultivating an Awakening, if you're interested. I think the only last thing that I can really say is just encourage you to make this a practice, that breathe, relax, step back, as Susan wrote it, right? To just watch the thoughts, watch the emotions, watch the body, and to start to let go of any attachment you have, and then see what arises and flows from it, and then trust it. Unless there are any other last questions, I think we may close here. On my next free online talk will be called, What is True Kindness? We often think we know what kindness is, but do we really? So I'll be exploring that topic in 2 weeks at 6:00 p.m. Pacific time. And I appreciate everybody's time and comments and all the support and donations those of you have given to me in the past and in the future. Have a beautiful rest of your day, guys.